Often you'll need to keep track of data or changes that happen in your app. For instance, whether a user is logged in, or if you have a shopping cart and you want to keep track of when a user adds something to their cart. Or maybe you have a list of clothing and you want to filter that list by only men's t-shirts, so you have to manage those filters. That's what state management is for. And there are two parts to state management in FlutterFlow: widgets and variables. So first, let's look at widgets. So some widgets, these ones right here, have their own state, manage their own state built in, so you don't have to do anything. So here's what that looks like. So let's just add in a text field right here. That's like the input. And if you just go to any sort of data binding property so you can see what you have available to you, you see that you've got this new option available, and it's called widget state. And if you twirl that open, you're going to see that text field right here. And just like with all of your other properties, it's going to be type aware and type safe. So we've got this little T here, so that tells us that this is a string. Now, I didn't name this very well, but one of the nice things about FlutterFlow is when you hover over it, you can see that both in the widget tree over here and on the canvas, it's going to show you what widget that is. But let's give it a better name so we can see this. So maybe this is going to be an email address. So when we come in here again, we can see that now it's an email address. Or let's choose another one of those. So maybe we want a drop down. Once again, if we just go into a bindable property right here, we can see that we have another item that's added to our widget state. So what this means is that this variable, the value of this variable, will be whatever is in that widget. So here, whatever the user types in will be in this email address variable. And here, whatever the user selects will be in this drop-down variable. And so let's just test this out. So we're binding our page title right here, and let's just add this to this input right here. And to be able to see this, we have to test it. So let's just run a test mode. All right, so if we just type in hello world, because we have this title bound to the state of this widget, these are linked. And anywhere where you can bind data, where you can set it from a variable, you can reference these widget states. This is especially helpful because this means that in a lot of scenarios, you don't have to set up your own variables and manage these state by themselves because it's already managed for you. So for instance, a common scenario would be with API calls. So let's just add in a button right here. So let's say we have a simple form submission where the user is just submitting their name. So let's come in here and say API call, and let's open up our action flow editor. Let's just select that form submit. And we've got this one variable, our name, and now we can bind it directly to that widget state. So we don't have to add in any additional variables. Okay, but sometimes you do need to manage your own variables. And that's the second part of managing state in FlutterFlow, variables. And there are three types of variables: component state variables, page state variables, and app state variables. And the difference is that they're just scoped to different parts. So your component state variables are defined in your components, your page state variables in your page, and your app state variables are available app-wide. So let me show you how these work. So I've got a component right here. It's just a little card component. And when you select the root widget or just click out here on the canvas, you're going to see this option right here. And this icon is the universal symbol for these state management variables. So you see it here, and when we look at our app state variables or our global variables, those are going to sit right there. And to add a variable, you just add it right there, give it a name, maybe user, and select the type of variable. And confirm it. And now in this component, you have access to that variable. So if we just come into our cart text right here and open it up, you see we've got this component state folder right here. And when you open it up, we can see our variable. And it works the same way with page state variables. So let's come into a page, and we click out onto the canvas or on that root widget. We've got this same icon and the same UI because it works the same way. Add a field. We're going to call this name, and set the type, and that's it. But let's look at some of these configuration options right here. So first, you can select whether this variable is going to be a list. So if I selected this right here, what I'm saying is that this variable is going to be a list of strings. If I were to change it to doubles, it'll now be a list of doubles. And a list is just a collection of these values. In other programming languages, this is called an array. So that's the first option. The next option is whether you want this to be nullable. nullable. That means, can this variable have the value of null? And if you don't know what null is just no value. Now, that's kind of confusing, but it's easier with an example. For instance, maybe you have an option for a user to put their middle name, but they don't have a middle name. Well, then you could use null. So null is a value, but it's a value that means there is no value. Or maybe if you have a favorite color and the user doesn't have a favorite color, you can select null. And we have this value because we need some sort of value to indicate this concept of nothing or no value. Okay, so if you select this, you are saying that the value of this variable, in this case, could either be a double or null. So right now I don't have this checked, which means that the value can only ever be a double. But if I select this, now I'm saying that this could either be a double, so it could be like 1.5, or null. Okay, well, when should you make a variable nullable? Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're going to do with the data and how you're going to store it. Now, this might seem like a dumb and obvious question, but you can simply just ask yourself, do I need null as a value? And if you need it, then you can use it, but if not, don't. Now, one common error that you're going to bump into when using state variables and nullable is when you're binding this to a text widget. So for instance, let's change this to a string and let's say it's nullable. Now in Flutter, and thus in FlutterFlow, Flutter is null safe, which means that variables can't have the value of null unless you explicitly say that they can. So by default, it can't have null. But if you say they can here, you might think, okay, well, everything is good now. I've said it can be null. But just remember that while this variable can now be null, that doesn't mean that anywhere where I use it can be null. So for instance, if I've got a text widget here, and this is one of the most common scenarios you're going to do, creating a state widget and then binding it to a text field. And let's just remove this here. If I want to bind that to my page state variable I just set up, it's going to crash. And let me show you that. And there we go. And it crashed because there's an unexpected null value. And of course, you might be thinking, but I said it can be null. And that's right. The variable can be null. This variable right here. So this is all fine. That's not what caused the crash. What caused the crash is that I bound it to a text widget, and this text widget can't have the value of null. And if you run into this, there's two solutions. You could either make this variable not nullable, so just click that off, or you could give this text widget a default variable value. And so if I do that, it will never have the value of null, and you're safe. Okay, so that's component state variables, page state variables, and last we have app state variables, and that's right over here. Now, we have these three different divisions of variables instead of just one, and that's so you can build more cleanly and efficiently, because you wouldn't want to have all of your variables sitting in just one place. But sometimes you need global variables or environment variables, and here's where you define them. You can just add a state variable, give it a name. I'm going to call this JWT for JSON Web Token. And of course, you can select the type, whether it's a list. And here you can select whether it's persisted. So that means if the user closes the app, whatever is in this variable will be saved on their disk. And one of the common scenarios is with user authentication, for instance, with JSON Web Tokens. And so if you accept that, the user can now still be signed in if they close the app and then open it later. But because I select that persisted fields, I get this other option right here, which is secure persisted fields. And if I turn this on, this will encrypt all the variables that are persisted. So right now, my JWT variable. And this JSON Web Token is a perfect example of doing that. We want that token to be encrypted. Okay, so that's how you define your variables. But how do you change them? Well, let me show you. So I've got this name variable right here, and let's just change it to email address so it's the same as our text field. And we're not going to make it nullable. And just give it an initial value. Beautiful. And so let's say we want to update that email address when the user clicks this button and puts in an email address there. Okay, so we go to our button and we want to come into our action flow editor here. We want to add an action. And if you scroll down, I'm just going to close this up and look at state management right here. You're going to have those app state and page state variables available to you. Now, we don't see our component states in here because those are scoped to the components. So if we were defining an action inside a component, then we would see those here. Okay, so this is a page state variable, and we want to select which variable it is we want to mutate. Now, we only have have one, so we only see one here. And then we're given some options for the type of update. So we can set the value, we can reset the value to its default. And depending on the variable type, so if it's an integer, you're going to see additional options here, like increment and decrement. But we're just going to set this value right here, and we are going to set it to the widget state of that text field. Beautiful. Lastly, we've got an option to update the page, and we've got two options in here. We can rebuild the current page or not rebuild it. All right, so what does this mean? Well, this doesn't mean everything is going to be rebuilt and repainted. Flutter is intelligent, so it's going to go through your widget tree and reevaluate. And if there is something that needs to be rebuilt, then it's going to rebuild it. So for instance here, on our page, this title property is bound to our page state variable. So when that variable updates, it's going to reevaluate the page and say, oh, this value is changed, so we need to rebuild this widget so you can actually see the updated value. So you can ask yourself, does anything on this page depend on this updated value right here? And if it does, you want to rebuild it then. But once again, you can think about this more of a reevaluation than a rebuild. And that's it. That's how you change the values of your state variables. Okay, so lastly, let's look at some practical examples of how to use state management. So let me show you a coffee app example. So here I've got a little coffee checkout page, and I've got two drop downs, one for the type of coffee and one for the number of espresso shots. And when the user selects each one of these, I want the price to update. So in this first drop down here, you can see that I've got two types of coffee, Ethiopia and Peru. And I've split out this drop down into the labels, that is what the user sees, and the values. So if the user selects Ethiopia, they'll see Ethiopia and they'll click on it, but the value of that selection will be 4 that I'm using for the price. And Peru is $2. Okay, then we've got espresso shots, and I've got 1, 2, and 3. So now let's do the state management stuff. So we're going to come into this text, and let's scroll to the top, and we want to go into this text field. And for this, we want to do a simple calculation where we're just adding these two values up. So we're going to use a code expression. Now let's start with the end in mind. So what value do we want returned? Well, right now we're just using no decimal places. So we can just select integer and close that up. And we're going to have two arguments in here, our first number and our second number. So we can just give these a name. This is going to be coffee, and it's going to be an integer. And the value is going to be set to that widget state, that first dropdown. Beautiful. And the second one is going to be the number of shots. That will also be an integer. And that will be set to that second dropdown. Beautiful. So now let's just write the expression. Coffee, we're just referencing that variable, that argument name plus shots. And that's it. Let's just check for errors, which you always have to do when you're writing an expression. That's great. And lastly, we want this to be displayed as this $. And so we can just change this to, let's say, a decimal, automatic, and we want to display it as a currency. And our currency symbol is USD. Confirm. And let's test it out. All right, so let's switch this to Ethiopia, $5, and of course we want 3 shots. Beautiful. So because we have access to these two widget states, we can manage the state of this total very easily. Let's look at one more example. So here I've got a simple product page, and I want to just be able to click on this button and add it to my cart. All right, so how would we do this? Well, first let's look at our data. So we've got an API call in here for our products, and here's the data. We've just got an array or a list of objects, and each object is a product with a title and a price and a description, etc., etc. So when the user clicks on this, I just want to dump that object into a list. All right, so we're going to need a variable to dump these products. And where can it be? Well, I want this to be available anywhere in the app, so I'm going to put it in this app state variables. And I've already got it set up right here. It's just a list of JSON. Okay, so that's our cart. That's where we're storing these products. So let's set up the logic, the action for adding it to the cart. So I'm going to click on this button right here and come in here. We're going to add an action and we're looking for the app state variables. We want to update that app state variables because we want to add it in. And which variable do we want to update? Well, we want to update our cart. And what type? Well, we want to add it to a list. Okay, and what do we want to add? Okay, well, here's our response from our API call. And here's the individual item that we have clicked on. Okay, so that's what we want. Beautiful. And that's it. Okay, but I want a way for our users to be able to see it and so we can confirm that it's actually been added into the cart. Okay, so I've got this cart button right here, which is going to show this bottom sheet, this cart right here, which I've got set up right here. And I've got this column set up that's bound to our cart app state variable. So if I just set up this before, I came into my app state and I'm just binding it to that cart variable. Beautiful. And then each of the items in here, I have bound to, for instance, the title property. That's this property. All right, beautiful. Let's test it out. All right, let's add in this first item and the second item, and let's check our cart. Beautiful. And those are the two ways to manage state in FlutterFlow: widget state and variables.